here are sort of three, the sort of three steps here is that you want to, figure out the framework to store this data, right? Either, and it doesn't have to be your final framework, but maybe it's a preliminary one, to have some place to have this framework for governance. Two, pick what content you're going to focus on and prioritize, and three, define the scope of within your organization that you're going to roll this out. So within the framework, you want all of the people who are involved in governance, your consumers and your stewards and everything, to be able to interact with this framework. So and that means establishing some stewardship and having a knowledge base to store the data and having a communication process to drive things. Now, you can do this in lots of ways. You can have sort of homegrown version of this where you're, creating stewardship with, just from some sort of committee, and then, or using an existing committee and just defining the set, and then using things like spreadsheets or Google Docs or a content management system to track your information that the stewards can interact with. And then from a communication process, maybe you can use an existing ticket system, or you can have, what I call the first step process, which is just a Post-it note with the names of the stewards that people can contact. Whatever it might be, like having some way to start is really important, but you just need to agree on what that is to start off with. Now, we have the data cookbook, which is designed to be that framework, right? So it is this, infrastructure for managing the stewardship, for a repository for all the knowledge base, and it drives the communication process and the workflows and all those kinds of things. And as much as I'd love for all of you to sign up for the cookbook, you just need to pick some way to do this, right? To track this information, and then you can evolve into it, right? You don't have to start perfect. I think you'll see our product, if you look at the pricing, it's affordable enough that I think there's ways you could start right away, but we'll do sales pitch at the end. But that framework is important. All right, so the second thing, once you've sort of decided how you're going to keep track of this stuff on paper or in Google Docs or in a tool like the cookbook, then you want to think about what your content focus is. So, we talked about this. Are you going to look at the business glossary, or are you going to document the reports? Are you going to set up your data system inventory, or track your ETL and your lineage, or create a data request process, or define your data quality rules and start assessing and monitoring data quality? Are you going to track your reference data? Are you going to start off first and write policies and before you do anything? Are you going to go through and tag everything that's got privacy codes? Or are you going to focus on external data systems? So those are the things that you want to think about. What you don't want to do is do all of these things at once, right? And so how do you prioritize how to start? And again, this is where you run into the biggest problems. Either you can't decide how you're going to do it from a framework standpoint, or you can't agree on where to start, like where to focus. And so to prioritize that, you want to think about what is the impact on the defined problems. So this is why I said, start with the why. So, if you go back to this set of items and I decide that tracking data quality is the most important thing that where I should start. But the problem that we had, was that, had to do with the fact that people didn't agree on how to pull the data, right? So data quality might have some impact on that, but it's not, it's not going to have that much return on the problem, the biggest identified problems that we have. So you want to think, what's the impact on the defined problems? You also want to weigh feasibility, all right? Data quality actually, in some ways, can be one of the hardest things to implement in terms of effort. There's things you can do pretty simply, but there's things that can be pretty complicated. So you want to think about the feasibility of implementing them too. What is the desire of the team that you're working with, right? That you should weigh that, because one of the other big killers of data governance is just lack of motivation. It is super important, and there's great return on what you're doing with governance, but it is also not something that, like, if you don't do it, the faculty's not going to get paid or whatever. And I remember some conference I was at several years ago, and there was a BI project going on, and someone was, this school was talking about this BI project, and the person was saying that he was complaining to his spouse about how, there wasn't enough support for his BI initiative, and his spouse said, well, honey, you realize that, your main job in IT is to make sure that everybody's payroll goes through and all that stuff. Like, and it's true. Like, that is oftentimes, it's hard to get the emphasis on things that can vastly improve the outcomes, but don't have aren't immediately impacting the outcome, like a system that stops working. So you got to figure out how to get people, what people are excited and interested in, and keep the motivation running, and then look at return on investment. So, what's the most impact that you can have with the least amount of effort, and then go from there. So it's important to say, like, you don't have to solve it all at once, right? And you can grow into things. And so spoiler alert, I recommend, as you'll see, that this is focusing on the data inventory pieces of this as a good place to start, and I'll explain why that is later. But again, prioritize this information, and you might get, again, disagreement around these things, but it's good to talk about, right? And it's not saying like what you will only do, but where you're going to start, right? We're prioritizing things. We're not, ruling things out. Right. Okay. So the last thing that you want to do in this sort of getting started phase, the first thing we did is figure out your framework. Second thing is prioritize your content and what you want, what you're going to work on. And then the last thing is to define the scope, right? So what we mean by that is, data governance is something that is sort of by definition and practice is something that is shared and standardized across the entire organization. It's like this organization-wide initiative, okay? But it's really hard to roll things out in a whole, across the whole organization, and that can be a big hindrance. Like, how do we do this, and how do we get everybody to move at once? Well, you don't. like stop trying to do that. Decide what the scope within your organization is that you want to start with, and then let it expand out. And it depends on your culture as well. But so if you say, hey, we're going to start and pilot this with this set of content, and we're going to do it in the human resources area first, or we're going to do it in the fundraising area, and that's also something to weigh based on your challenges, right? If the biggest issue is that you're having difficulty with reporting, and the most important area where you need to get reporting out is in enrollment or in fundraising or whatever, then that's a good area to start, or where you have feasibility and interest, right? And then you can expand out to a goal area and bring this to other places.